Welcome to Based on a True Story, the podcast that compares your favorite Hollywood movies with history. Speaking of history, today we are going to learn about one of the most classic pieces of cinema in film history, Casablanca. And while they did a colorized version of Casablanca, of course, we're sticking to the original black and white, so let's maybe desaturate things in here a little bit just to set the mood for our synopsis. Casablanca was released during World War II in the year 1942, and it's also set during World War II era Morocco, where refugees from Europe passed through while escaping the Nazis. At the center of the story is Rick Blaine. He's played by Humphrey Bogart. Rick owns an American-themed nightclub in Casablanca called Rick's Cafe American. And Rick lives a detached life from everything going on around his cafe, but that changes when his former lover, Ilse Lund, arrives with her husband, Victor Laszlo. Victor Laszlo is a prominent resistance leader fleeing the Nazis. Ilse is played by Ingrid Bergman, while Victor Laszlo is played by Paul Henreid, by the way. The film follows Rick's internal struggle as he's torn between helping Laszlo escape and rekindling his romance with Ilse. In the end, Rick makes the ultimate sacrifice, ensuring Ilse and Victor's safe departure, understanding that their love cannot survive in the chaos of war. But in a twist at the end, Rick isn't killed or turned over to the Nazis for his involvement in letting Ilse and Victor go. Instead, Rick forms an alliance with the local police chief, Claude Rains' version of Captain Renault. To help us separate fact from fiction today, we'll be joined by Bob LeMent, who has been publishing his internet radio show for 25 years now over at staticradio.com. But before we chat with Bob, we need to set up our game, Two Truths and a Lie. Now, if you're new to the show, here's how it works. I'm going to give you three things. Two of them are true, and that means one of them is just an all-out lie. Are you ready? Okay, here they are. Number one. Casablanca was not actually a pathway to escaping the Nazis. Number two, actors who worked on the movie actually escaped using a similar pathway in the movie. Number three, there was a Jewish community in Morocco during the movie's timeline. Got him? Okay, now as you're listening to our story today, your challenge is to identify which one is the lie, and then at the end, I'll open up this envelope containing the answer to see how well you did. And now it is time to connect with Bob LeMent about that classic film, Casablanca. Our movie today is a little different than what we normally cover here on the podcast, but even though it doesn't claim to be based on a true story, Casablanca is not only set during the historical backdrop of World War II, it was also released during the war as well. So if you were to give Casablanca a letter grade for its historical accuracy overall, what would it get?
I think it was pretty close. So I think I would give it somewhere around a B. I don't want to say B minus, but I'll give it I don't want to do minuses or pluses. So let's just do B.
A B? Okay, that's good. That's good. I mean, again, it is one of the things I'm kind of surprised that it's that high, being that it was released during the war as well. And we know that there's a lot of propaganda films that get released and such like that. So I'm glad to hear that it was pretty close.
I think so. I think, there's a lot of instances there where they were, pretty close to what was happening. And since it was on, right, everything was happening at that time. It's kind of interesting that they would, put all that out there and not try to spin it too much one way or the other. So, plus, to be honest, parts of the movie were extremely vague. So, it's accurate in the sense that I think that's probably what the times were, right? So you didn't want to go one way or the other too much because you didn't know what was going to happen.
That's true. And I guess I didn't think about it until just now too. Like, they also didn't know a lot of that stuff. Like, we didn't know a lot of what actually happened until after the war anyway.
Right.
And so that's another element to it that, didn't think about
that. Because they were, this was, the whole story of Casablanca is trying to get away from the war, right? So people are using this as a point of departure, more than a point of arrival. And trying to get away from all of the, the madness of Europe at the time. And so I think it's fairly accurate in that portrayal. Obviously, it was much more gruesome and horrible than it's portrayed. But that's Hollywood, right? So they're not going to show all. Well, at the time, that's Hollywood. Now maybe they would be more gruesome, but back then it was all very clean and oh, they're running away and but it's not like people were tortured and on screen and so forth. So yeah, which I'm sure happened even in Casablanca.
You mentioned getting away from the war, and at the beginning of the movie, it explains the storyline of why this is taking place in Casablanca. Basically, it says that with the outbreak of World War II in Europe, the civilians are trying to escape the war by heading to America. And to do that, they need to get to Lisbon, Portugal. Some people could get there directly, but because of the war, the movie explains that not everyone could get to Lisbon directly. So they had to kind of take this roundabout path from Paris to Marseille, across the Mediterranean to Iran and Algeria, and then across the northern coast of Africa to Casablanca, which is in Morocco. And then from there, people would try to barter or buy an exit visa from Casablanca to go the 380 or 615 kilometers, as the crow flies, to Lisbon, to then ultimately get to America. Was that an actual path that people took to try to escape the war in Europe?
I believe so. Yeah. So I think that was a path. It's kind of like a political end around, right? So you couldn't just go, hey, I'm in Paris, which is a major metropolitan city, even then, right? And just I'm gonna hop on a plane and go to America. That wasn't going to happen. And so they had to go someplace in order to get where they needed to go. And so yeah, this was a weird little stop along the way, as it were, in order to get to America, because you couldn't just go straight. You couldn't go. I mean, you couldn't fly to London, right? So there was no way out of the situation other than going through, kind of these backwater places in order to avoid the political, devastation, maybe we'll say, that was going on at that time because of the war and all the different things that were happening. So yeah, I think the interesting thing to me, I mean, it's very sugar coated for perspective from today and so forth, but at the time, I think it was deemed fairly tough in its portrayal of things that were happening for the general public. So there were, they had guns and they were Nazis, and people were running for their lives, a lot of them, and it didn't really broach the the elephant in the room, which was the Jewish persecution so much. These were just I don't want to say run of the mill people. I don't think that's the right word to say, but they weren't in the Holocaust aspect of things. They were, kind of the folks who were the bystanders who got caught up in everything, and obviously some of them were, as we watch the movie, some of them were against the war, against the Nazis, and so forth, but it really didn't talk about the Holocaust so much in that regard. Now, if you look into the movie as who was working on the movie, it talks a lot about the Holocaust, right? So there are people who worked on this movie who knew things were going on and wanted to portray that, this was not a good situation, without being so overt as to say, that this was happening.
Can you give an example of what you mean by that?
I'm just saying there were people in the movie who have escaped the Nazis, and there are extras in the movie, and they're characters in the movie, they're actors in the movie, and there's also in the movie there are folks who were of the Jewish faith who knew things were going on, and they were working on this as I don't know, I can't get into their heads, but as this was going on, you can't help but think, yes, we need to expose these people as not being good people, but in a kind of non-overt way, right? This is a bad situation. They couldn't talk about the Holocaust or anything, but they could talk about how bad the war is, and so I think that was also if you look, kind of an underlying thing, I'm sure if you would ask any one of those folks who are working on it, that would be, a surreptitious goal of theirs is to make light of the fact that this was happening, and you need to pay attention, everybody. You're not going to be, it's going to get you as well. We're just in the first line. So, yeah.
Yeah, which kind of goes back to it being released during the war. Now we think of it as a period piece, perhaps, but it was that during that time, like it was going on right then. So it was a way of getting that message out. I didn't think about that it would, it's not a documentary, but it's telling what's going on right now.
Right. Yeah. If you take into consideration another movie that was, kind of during this time period as well, earlier than this time period, actually, by a little bit, but, very much in tune with kind of the things that were going on. The Great Dictator, Charlie Chaplin. There is no ambiguity that he says Hitler is a horrible person. This one's a little more ambiguous. But The Great Dictator, it was shouting it from the rafters, hey, everybody, this is not going to be good for anybody. So this was, oddly enough, you would think that would have been later, but it was earlier than Casablanca. And Casablanca is kind of the, let's get everybody on board with this politically and move our, thing forward, our position forward, but not be, too upsetting in the political situation, I think. So,
well, the movie doesn't really talk about dates very much, but there is one line of dialogue that mentions it being December of 1941. And of course, we know Pearl Harbor was attacked in December of 1941. That brought the United States into the war. The movie doesn't even mention that at all. What it does mention is things like Free France and Vichy France. And in case of Casablanca specifically, they call it unoccupied France. Can you fill in a little bit more historical context? Because we're, recording this long after World War II, obviously. And again, this was released in 1942. So just after the timeline of the movie itself in December of 1941. So can you give some more historical context that we don't see in the movie that the audiences would have known then about these fragmentations of France and the location there in Casablanca?
That's a good question. And I wish I could give you like a really detailed thing, but I can't. But off my, what I can tell you is that basically, Nazi Germany occupied France. And there was a point in time where, everything's a mess. That's where the French resistance comes into existence because they don't want to be occupied. And if you remember in the movie, they're talking about these papers that are signed by Charles de Gaulle, right? So those are very, very valuable, right? Because this is at a point in transition where the Nazis are invading, and the French government is kind of going along with it a bit in order to kind of, not have everybody get killed, I guess. And so that's why when they mention that in the movie, that's why it's so important, because they still have some, I won't say power, but they have some influence over the situation at this point. And because, not too long after this, Charles de Gaulle, who cares if he signed anything, right? Because the Nazis can, totally occupy everything and batten down the hatches, and France is part of Germany in essence during the war at that time. So this is that weird political time where they're trying to figure things out. And the interesting thing is I believe not too far after this time is also when they were trying to get Britain to sign on to something and allowed the Nazis to occupy them as well, in effect, right? A political strategy without having to be a military strategy. But they were moving towards the military strategy and said, hey, if you want to just surrender like France did, go right ahead. We'll let you. And they'll be part of Germany as well, right? And so this movie portrays a really interesting time where people could still move, even though not freely, but move somewhat by this kind of political end around going through Northern Africa. And so it really is, and I think maybe that might be part of the attraction for the movie, for the ages, as it were, is because it's portraying a time that was so, interesting now in hindsight. At the time, probably so, incredibly frightful, of what was happening. And can you imagine? I mean, you and I live in the United States. Can you imagine if all of a sudden something happened? It's like, well, you can't go, if we go into Man in the High Castle, you can't go past the Rockies because we're occupied on this side by one group, and the other side across the Rockies is the other group. So you can't do that. We can't even fathom that. But this was happening to in Europe, and it was happening to these people, and it just, historically looking back at it, is like, how can you fathom that? How can we, as a generation beyond all of this, a couple generations beyond all this, but how can you bring that into your mind, because we've never had to experience. But here you can see it. I mean, albeit very light in its presentation. People get killed and whatnot, but it's not gruesome. It really is an interesting movie for that. And the reason I brought this up, because I recently watched it before I contacted you, and amazingly, a very well-made movie, and it moves, right? So if you think of 1942, a lot of movies nobody watches a lot of movies from that time period because they're not very, the pace is very, very slow. And this one actually has a pretty good pace. I know that doesn't answer the other part of the question, but it's very interesting to me that this movie was so well paced and so, and you kind of buy it, you're into the what happens to these characters, because it is kind of an interesting situation. And then the corruption, right? So, I mean, for all intents and purposes, Rick is a gangster. He's selling access, right? There were other people selling access as well. You want to get out of here? Well, guess what? I mean, he was a nice gangster, but he's a gangster nonetheless.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that leads right into my next question, because I have a feeling I already know the answer to this, but a lot of movies change the names or make up characters completely. But I have to ask, like Rick Blaine, Ilsa Lund, Victor Laszlo are kind of the three main characters. And then there's the local French prefect of the police, Captain Renault. And then the German military officer, Major Strasser, is kind of, those are the main characters in the movie. Are any of them based on real people?
It's based off of a play. I'm trying to remember the title off the top of my head here. Everyone can go to Rick's Place. I think I can't remember the. I don't know if you're familiar with that play. I'm blanking on it here for some reason, but I don't think that any. I think they're kind of a conglomerate of people who are going through there. I mean, the French, Jardin person there, he was, he was somebody, but I don't think he was that person with that name. And he was a gangster as well, if you think about it, because he was playing with people's lives and, you can leave, you can't leave, where's the money, all that kind of stuff. But I think they're all kind of a conglomeration of things that happened during that time rather than actual people of the time. So it's not a true story in any way, other than it's based on experiences. Everybody's welcome at Rick's Place. I think that's what it's called.
Okay. Yeah. And that makes sense. I mean, a lot of movies just completely make up characters like that too.
Well, plus there was a time where I don't think that they really wanted to do that, to be honest with you. I mean, can you imagine if they're still probably
being outed by a Hollywood movie. Yeah, that's still going on. That's true. That's very, very true. Yeah.
So they're like, hey, you don't use my name. Hey, I'm still trying to make money on this situation.
Exactly. And especially for, according to the movie, Victor Laszlo is part of the underground fighting against the Nazis. We never really find out exactly what his role is. There was a point at line of dialogue where he says something like, I'm privileged to be one of the great leaders, or one of the leaders of a great movement. And then we see that Major Strasso is trying to use safe passage, or he's trying to get safe passage out of Casablanca, and Major Strasso is trying to use that to bribe him into giving up the other leaders of the resistance across major European cities. So we get the idea that Laszlo knows, is very well connected with the resistance. And then there's another part in the movie where Strasser is speaking directly with Laszlo and tells him that he's an escaped prisoner of the Third Reich. And that's why Strasser is there in Casablanca, tasked with making sure that Laszlo stays in Casablanca and doesn't leave. But as I was watching it, I couldn't help but think, why wouldn't Strasser just take Laszlo into custody the moment that he sees him? The movie seems to imply the reason for that is because Casablanca is in unoccupied France, like we talked about. But looking at this from a historical lens, did the Germans behave differently in unoccupied France as they did in occupied territories?
Yeah, I think so. So, we don't have the benefit of living through it, which I'm glad. But there was weird political alliances and weird political happenings all during World War II, as it kind of built up, right? And so, yes, I would say that I don't think that they were as nice as they are in this movie, right? Where they're singing the German, I can't even pronounce it, Die Rock and Rhein, and then they start singing La Marseillaise, over it, and it was kind of like, a rivalry for football teams or something.
Thinking West Side Story,
right? That I'm sure that didn't go on, and go over very well. But no, I think there was they held to the political agreements because it's much easier to, like, when France surrenders, right? It's much easier to take over a country that way than it is to bomb them and shoot them and go through all the fighting. And so I think at this point in the game, the Nazis wanted to do that. So they were probably on, for lack of a better term, their best behavior. And so then, it kind of makes sense that I also think that it's more of an amalgam, right? So I don't know that they just did one-on-one, let's watch people not get out of the country kind of a situation. But I think it's more, looking at trying to build that into the storyline. That was probably the easiest way to do that. I think that they had people stationed and they would communicate and say, so-and-so is going to be in your area, keep an eye on them, kind of just like the French gendarme was keeping an eye on everybody and trying to make his money and live the good life in Casablanca. And so, yeah, but I don't know that it was just they were chasing each other around. But hey, maybe they did, but I couldn't imagine. But you're right. But you mentioned, he's like part of something. Again, all very vague. They didn't say the resistance. They didn't say that. We don't even know why Rick is there. They never explain why he's got all this set up other than it's obviously lucrative. But he obviously didn't move in yesterday. He's been there for a while and he's set up shop. And this, to me, it was kind of implied that he'd been there for quite some time and he's taken advantage of the situation. As opposed to he moved there to do this particular, work. I think he was doing a lot of other stuff. And this just happened to pop up and he's like, yeah, let's make some money on this new idea.
Yeah, like you said, as a gangster, it's take advantage of the situation however you can.
Yeah, this is good money. These people want to get out of here. So, yeah, obviously he's got a heart of gold in the movie because he does help them escape, essentially. But I think so, and I think it's all kind of set up to be not strictly historical, but somewhat historical.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And you mentioning Rick and kind of his backstory, we hear little bits and pieces throughout the movie. He's born in New York City, so he is an American. But then in 1935, it talks about how he ran guns in Ethiopia. And in 1936, he fought in Spain on the loyalist side. But that's as detailed as the movie gets. Do we know from history if there were things that happened in Ethiopia in 1935 and Spain in 1936 that the movie might be alluding to with Rick's backstory?
I wish I knew the answer for you on that. I just looked that up. I think that those things did happen from my limited understanding on that aspect of things. That those were, they kind of Star Trekked it. You know what I mean? So they took real cherry picked things out of history to put into his story. Like Zephyr Cochrane. He's the person before him was, Isaac Newton and all these real people. And then you get to Zephyr Cochrane and he breaks the warp barrier. But so if you're familiar with that, sorry. And then, so yeah, I think that those were actual things that happened. I took it that, but I did not run that down necessarily. Sorry.
No, yeah, that makes sense though. I mean, because again, it's alluding to there's something vague there, kind of like with the resistance or that element, and that they give it. One of the reasons it stood out to me was because it gave dates and places where most of the movie it doesn't really do that kind of stuff, and so that they did that makes me think, yeah, okay, there must be something there that he was involved in. But then it again alludes, since it mentioned December of 1941, like you had said, he's already been there in Casablanca, and that was kind of the next thing that he was doing. And so he was doing things in other places, kind of behind the scenes, and then now he's in Casablanca. He's been there apparently since after 1936 or at some point after that.
He's kind of like a gun for hire in a way in the earlier stories, and now he's older, and so this was the new venture that he took on because, maybe he didn't want to shoot people anymore, or at least not as many.
We talked about him a little bit, but I do want to ask a little bit more specifically about the relationship between Captain Renault and Major Strasser in the movie. Renault is the French law enforcement, Strasser is the Nazi official. And again, Casablanca being in unoccupied France. But Major Strasser is welcomed by Renault and many of the locals in the movie calls it unoccupied France. So it's not occupied. I'm assuming that's referring to, not occupied by the Nazis, but then they're still welcomed. What would the relationship have been like? Would the Nazis actually have been welcomed by local law enforcement? Do you think they foresaw what was going to happen, even though it wasn't occupied by the Germans, but they're like, oh, we better appease them because it's coming? Or what do you think was happening there?
My guess would be that they're, obviously stuff's happening. They're seeing things and so forth. And just like Britain, France was colonialist, right? And if going forward in history, part of the reason Vietnam became such a mess was because of colonialism, and that was French influenced. And so I think that they, it's the times and the political thing. I don't know that they would say welcomed as much as tolerated, more than likely. And so, because what are you going to do? You don't want them, the powers in Germany to say, okay, well, now we're just going to take over this area, because it'd probably be a pretty easy job. And obviously it was, because they did take over most of North Africa. By the time World War II chugged along, that's the whole Rommel aspect of things, and the Desert Fox and all that took over a huge part of Africa for the Nazis. And so, everybody's playing it cool, right? So everything gets to happen. And they kind of in the movie, they go into, everybody falls into cronyism and being corrupt. And so, the Germans' money spends as well as whoever else is coming through there. So you play both ends to get the money. So yeah, I can imagine that, I don't know that they would say open arms, but I think for sure there was not any, they're like, yeah, whatever. Yeah, you can come in here and drink as well.
Yeah, I like the way you say that they, they weren't necessarily welcome, but they were tolerated. And the idea of it sounds like they're trying to survive. And like with Renault being the leader, the law enforcement there, but also recognizing that he really doesn't. I mean, if he does the wrong thing, they're going to attack anyway, and so might as well just make the best of the situation that you have.
He was corrupt, and so he's trying to cash in because, guess what? He's at the port of exit. So if the going gets too tough, I've got these papers with Charles de Gaulle's signature on them, and I will, make my exit at the right time. And so it really is, even though when you watch it, it's not very, it's not like it is today, but it's a very corrupt situation. And I think it's portrayed in the film um, as palatable as corruption could be portrayed at the time period. They're not going to be, overly terrible, cutting off pinkies and whatnot. So, but I think for the time period, this was, corruption at its best.
You mentioned the letters from de Gaulle, and you talked about that briefly before too, but that's a core concept in the movie, that these letters of transit were signed by General de Gaulle. And there was also mentions of Captain Renault having exit visas that he's signing, but the letters of transit from de Gaulle are different because the movie specifically says that they cannot be rescinded or even questioned, which of course implies to me like, okay, well, of course, the people that are going to want this are the ones that the Nazis would probably want to question.
That's right. Don't question me. Right. Exactly.
Yeah,
They're
right.
the ones that don't want to have any, they're trying to skate right out of there without any kind of problems. Whereas, the other ones are like, maybe it's going to work, maybe it's not going to work. So
is there any truth to the concept of those letters that we know of?
That we know of? I do believe that is true, at least to a point, right? So that was, those were something that was available at the time until basically de Gaulle stepped down. And so a lot of people got out via that mechanism, right? So that was, when you watch a lot of these movies, World War II movies and everything, there's, with all these different things that are happening, corruption and everything, this like Schindler's List, right? So the list was there to save people because, well, they need to make ammunition, munitions and so forth. And so Oskar Schindler was collecting people and saying that they were invaluable. And that was, so I think with all this corruption and everything going on, that was, the corruption on the good side of things, where it was helping people get out of the situation. And I mean, it's happened since then in all kinds of different situations. And so, yeah, I believe so. And the now, as far as the officer, the French officer, have signing those, I don't know about that. That may be a part of the invention to show his corruptness. But I think when they're invoking a real person, right, Charles de Gaulle and so forth, I think all that is factual, to a point. Obviously, not forever. I'm sure he didn't give it to those people or anything, but But
the concept of them being a thing, yeah, which again goes back to something that I think is important to understand when watching this movie, is that it was released in 1942 during the war as well. And so the time period is very different than if we were to make a movie today of the same story. We would know a lot more about the stuff going on behind the scenes, but also it just, like, the political side of it would be very different, I think.
I mean, we have a war going on over in the Ukraine, right? I don't think that we know more than they knew then.
Well, but I mean, like, we would know more about what happened in Casablanca in World War II if the movie was made today now, is what I'm referring to. Yes.
After the fact,
yeah, no,
sure.
no. But because this was made during the war, they didn't know a lot of the political machinations behind the scenes that were going on. They just knew that there were these things that were going on. And so maybe that's why they were so vague in a lot of it.
But there are literally people in this movie who took the route.
Yeah, fair. Yeah.
So they knew, right? And they're working on the movie. So I think the vagueness had more to do with the political climate probably than it had anything to do with giving away any secrets. Because they talk, and there's if you look on IMDb, they talk about when they did the whole, singing thing from to the La Marseillaise and everything. There were literally the people who were in the scene were crying because they had gone through this, they had escaped. And now they're, in the film industry, and they're trying to get by, right, during this time period, and they're crying in this scene because this is so personal. And so, I don't know that they necessarily, all the inside knowledge that they would have had made it into the movie, but there was known things. And just like The Great Dictator, they knew that stuff was happening, as far as the Holocaust was concerned, way back then, and that Charlie Chaplin put into the movie, to insinuate, but it wasn't totally proven. And I mean, some people probably knew, but not everybody. And so it's a whole weird political climate that everybody was trying to navigate because it was so contentious, right? So you're dealing with, at this point, we'd call him a madman, right? In Hitler and the Nazi machine. And you're trying to not get overly involved in having everybody be killed in a war. And it was just massive. And so, you say we were brought into the war after Pearl Harbor, right? But we were involved in the war well before Pearl Harbor, because we were
Officially brought into the war.
Yeah, we were supplying the British with all kinds of good stuff, because they were, at that point, they were the major power against the Nazis. And to this day, we're supplying Ukraine with all sorts of good stuff in that skirmish. And so it's not, it's not as if all this kind of just poof, happened in a moment. So all this is ongoing. And I think that's part of where you talk about Rick and his weird background and so forth. All through history, this stuff doesn't just happen overnight. Typically, it percolates and brews, and then things pop here and there, and then finally it, comes above the fray there, and everybody becomes aware of it. And so, yeah, I think that this is like that. So we're just emerging into the broader political ideologies that came out of all this. And at this point, when this was made, still not so sure where everybody's at. I mean, people were taking meetings with Hitler from the United States all the way up until war was declared, right? And I'm talking, known people. So it is weird. And I think the interesting thing about this movie is the ambiguity of all of this, right? So it's so ambiguous in parts that I think that plays well to the politics that was happening, because they all had to get along still, but things were happening. But you didn't, and people were obviously fleeing, but it wasn't like it was a full-blown situation yet.
Kind of like you were saying before, just there were a lot of people that were tolerating each other and not welcoming, but just a lot of toleration going on, even on the political side too.
Yeah, it was. And then you think of where it's at in Morocco. I mean, it's not Paris, right? Even in 1942, Morocco is not Paris. And so it really is not a major metropolitan, forward-thinking kind of place back then. And so all this is kind of, a microcosm. It's terrible to say, the Gilligan's Island of World War II, right there in Casablanca.
The other example there, nice.
because Gilligan's Island was the microcosm of the rich and the poor and the working class and everything, and that was how it was built, right? And so with the movie, that's what they kind of built with this too, was, you have people taking advantage, you have people who are trying to get away, and you have people who are just living there, and you have, the waiters and so forth at the bar who are, just trying to get through, right? And so it is a microcosm for, I think, the times.
Makes sense. You mentioned people kind of taking advantage, and other than Rick, who we kind of had referred to before, there's another guy named Ferrari, and he runs the big competitor to Rick's, which is called the Blue Parrot. And according to the movie, he's got a monopoly on the black market. At one point, talks about how buying and selling humans is the leading commodity in Casablanca. Was human trafficking a major issue in Casablanca during World War II?
I hate to tell you this. Human trafficking still a major issue, Dan.
Fair point.
I don't know on. I don't know what I would say that chances are there was some of that going on. I don't know to what extent and so forth. It's interesting that if you look at the two characters, Rick looks very American, and then the Ferrari guy he's trying to acclimate. He's wearing a fez. He shouldn't be wearing a fez. If you look at him, he's got a suit on and so forth. He's wearing a fez, and he's trying to be a little more local. But he's obviously not. He's obviously, American or British background and so forth. As far as the human trafficking at the time, that's a good question. I wish I had a better answer for you. I would say that that unfortunately it's still an issue today, and so chances are, if that was the route that other people were taking, then that's the route that they would take for that as well. The interesting thing that I found was that there was a lot of Jewish people in Morocco, in that part of northern Africa, and so then they obviously wanted to leave because of what was happening, which I don't know that it really dawned on me. That's a little bit of some research that I did. It was interesting to me to note that, because now when we think about that, we don't think of it as being particularly an area where a lot of Jewish people would be. So that I found that interesting.
Yeah, was it something that they were trying to escape from Europe, or was it a community that was already there?
Already there.
Oh, okay. See, I would have expected that. Okay, everybody's fleeing Europe, and would make sense.
It was already part of the community. They would live there, and so this wasn't something they moved there. Obviously, I'm sure there's a wave of people during that time period, but no, talks about them being having a community there.
I wonder if they were involved in, think of with Victor Laszlo and being part of the resistance, if then he connected to, the local community because they knew what was going on and helping people escape. It seems like it could be a logical connection.
It would be. It seems like it would be a good connector, but they don't go into that too much with the movie at all. They don't actually get into the genetic stuff that the Nazis were into for that time too much in the movie. And again, I think that was just the political climate. They didn't want to broach that.
Throughout the movie, it takes place just across a few days in the movie, but there is a flashback sequence with Rick and Ilsa in Paris, and there's artillery in the distance. It can be heard, and then Rick mentioned, the German 77th is about 35 miles away. And then there's another scene of reading newspaper and talk about how the Germans are going to be in Paris by Wednesday or Thursday at the least. How well do you think the movie did just explaining the German invasion of Paris from the perspective of citizens like Rick and Ilsa who were living there at the time?
I don't think they did a very good job. But
really? Okay.
No, I don't think so. They talk about that and everything, but it's always at a distance, right? And
true. Yeah.
It's as if, well, we're above all this, so it's just the unlucky people or the poor people are getting bombed or whatever because we're here in this hotel and we're doing fine. Where we know it wasn't like that. It was whenever they took over Paris, then there was fighting and so forth. And it was indiscriminate, right? It was wherever the fighting was happening. It wasn't like they said, well, we can't go over by the Ritz because, all the rich people are there. So I think it was a light way to bring it into the script, I think, but not really, if you watch, other movies like Saving Private Ryan and so forth, and you see the bombed out buildings and people still living in them. I think that's a little bit more realistic portrayal of how things happened, where, fighting happens. There's so much, just ancillary destruction, and people who aren't even involved in the war are dying, and then their family has to carry on, and all they've got is what's left. And so, yeah, it was very, the whole movie is very light on the realism, I think, in that in that aspect of things. Yeah, and then also, they never went to Paris, obviously, so because they couldn't at that time.
Oh, the Germans you're talking about. Yeah. Yeah.
No, I mean the movie. They didn't. They were all in the studio in Hollywood.
Oh, well, right. Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's a good point. Yeah. Since it was yeah, that's a good point. I didn't even think about that.
They weren't in Morocco. They weren't anywhere near anything.
Fair point.
They were. So the whole movie, and one of the aspects of the movie is whenever they are at the airfield and we're going to get on the plane and everything, that was indoors, because they couldn't film outside during the war at night, because Hollywood itself was under alert. So one of the things is the plane is a model constructed, and they actually, one of the great trivia pieces from Casablanca is the plane is a model, and the people who, when you see them by the plane, they're children, and they're dressed up as adults in order to get scale, right? So to make the plane look bigger, because they could not film at an airfield because they were not allowed to have lights at night unless they were needed. So everything was dark because they were worried about invasion. And we can spin off into the Battle of Los Angeles, which is kind of a famous thing in and of itself, during that time period where something was in the sky and they shot the heck out of it, and no one knows what it was.
UFOs in the sky. I think that's what that was when it's right. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, they assume it's a weather balloon or something, but
of course it's always a weather
balloon. That's how high alert the West Coast of the United States was at that time. Was, there were people who, that was the civil defense, and they would sit out all night and watch the skies. And so, yeah,
which is something you won't even think about watching the movie, like that. Yeah. I mean, especially watching the movie now. I mean, you think of, okay, it was during the war, but you don't think about little things like that, of even the production of the movie having to change because of the war that was still going on as they were filming it. Yeah,
and so that was, so since it's all basically a studio movie, it's all pretty much inside. I think all that was inside, even the airplane thing. It was just in a big soundstage off in the distance and so forth, because you never really see the sky. It's night.
It's all foggy and stuff too.
Yeah, it's foggy, exactly. It's interesting like that. So, I mean, if you think about it, even they were under the threat because they were restricted.
Yeah. No, that makes sense.
Couldn't do night shoots. Couldn't go to Morocco. Couldn't hang out in Casablanca, actually. They just had to do it all from the studio, and relative safety, I think, at the time.
Is in the final scene at the airport, the way it all kind of ends, you have the Rick giving the letters of transit to Victor and Elsa so that they can take the last plane out of Casablanca. Rick stays behind. He ends up killing the Nazi Major Strasser, and so that the Germans won't try to pursue the plane. But then in a surprise move at the very end, Captain Renault doesn't turn in Rick, but then he orders his police officers to go look for the other usual suspects. I think he says, like, he has normal people that they round up whenever there's something wrong. And it seems obvious that ruse isn't going to last very long. So at the very end of the movie, you see Rick and Renault kind of walking off in the distance, heading towards a free French garrison in Brazzaville, which again was kind of something that seemed pretty significant, that they would just mention Brazzaville. Was there any significance to that mention at the end of the movie?
I think that it was a safe haven still at that point, as things were falling apart, but everything was like dominoes. And so, and it is interesting that that our French authority, kind of turncoat, but they kind of allude to his, French patriotism, I suppose, in a way. It probably, money was also a factor, um, because they're throughout the movie, the Germans are never portrayed. They're not portrayed as super. Well, they're portrayed as negative, but they're not portrayed as being in on the game. You know what I mean? Rick and the blue parrot, they're all in on the game. And then the Nazis are kind of there, but they're ruining the game, as it were. And so, yeah, I think that's also part of it. And he's kind of a which way the wind blows kind of guy in the whole movie, anyhow. And so I think that was part of that deal. But yeah, I think they were just heading to the next free spot and on their way to, wherever they had to go next as things were falling apart.
Just assume Casablanca, they're done in Casablanca and head to wherever is safe next.
Right, wherever is safe, yeah, or whatever they can make money,
Yeah.
Because we started out saying it, that they're corrupt, they're gangsters of the period, and that's how they had to flow with go with where the money's going to be. Whenever it gets to be no money, what's the point of hanging out there? Yeah, but it's weird that he let them go. But that was the whole thing, that he knew her, and they kind of had some kind of a history, and that was a little bit vague as well, about their whole history. But he would make that move and not just take the flight himself. He could have easily just went with her, said, "Hey, let's leave this other guy to be caught by the Nazis." But but that's not a happy ending. So,
yeah, I think they try to. The impression I got was that it's a way of him being selfless because he loves her, and so it's kind of we'll always have Paris, and you always get that line too, right? That classic line. You wouldn't have that otherwise.
Yeah. Well, at the time, though, I mean, that was a super hopeful thing to say, right?
We'll always have Paris.
Paris has fallen.
Yeah, right? True.
We are probably incredibly lucky that the Eiffel Tower wasn't dismantled to make tanks. You know what I mean? So we'll always have Paris in this movie is an incredibly hopeful statement. Because
I think about that.
Yeah, because it was all happening, and they're like, oh, we had metal rationing and everything in the United States, let alone in Britain and in Germany and other parts of Europe, right? So, yeah, we're so lucky that most of the architecture wasn't just destroyed in order to support the war effort.
Which if not just taken apart, but also, like you mentioned, just that so many buildings bombed out and cities bombed out and things like that, that artillery and bullets don't care where they fall.
Right, exactly. And they were rebuilt in some areas, right? And so, but there's a lot of things in Paris that are from before the war that are still there, thankfully, because of the way that it played out. But it could have won anyway. And so, we'll always have Paris is, an inspiring thing to say, right? Because they don't know. We may not have Paris.
Yeah.
At that point, who knows what's going to happen to Paris? All up in the air.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Well, at this point, Casablanca is like over 80 years old, so I doubt they're going to do a remake. But just for the fun of it, if you were directing a remake of this film today, what's something that you would do differently?
That is a tough one, because this is one of those movies that you can't touch, right? It's like Citizen Kane. I'm going to remake Citizen Kane. Instead of a sled, he's going to have a motorbike. It's not going to work. I think if they were to try to remake it today, just in the trends for, things and so forth, it would be, I think it would be more of a chase movie than it is in here. Here it's very much a drama, very much, there's, stuff happening, romance kind of, and a drama and all these people involved. And it's, but I think it would be like, There's a movie called Salt with um, that was a chase movie or something like that. It probably would be like that rather than being a drama like it is now and more just people talking because you want them to be on the run and see the route. Um, I think they could probably get away with that. They probably wouldn't be able to call it Casablanca. It would just be one of the stops along the way. But yeah, I think that's probably what would happen. And then you could still have, your Rick and your Renault and so forth in there to help you get through and make the tension with Strasser and so forth. But yeah, it wouldn't be the same movie. I don't know. The thing is, a lot of these older movies, it's hard to remake just because storytelling has changed and what people want to see has changed. And so to me, that's what makes this movie so interesting is the fact that it still holds up, even though tastes and what people want to see um, have drastically changed over time. So it's interesting that people still can go back to this one and say, this is pretty good. I liked it.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it has. I mean, movies have been influenced, obviously, like we talked about a lot of the history behind the movie, but there's actually a Rick's Cafe in Morocco because that's been inspired by the film and things like that. And then we talk about things like, we'll always have Paris, and there's lines like, here's looking at you, kid. What are some of the favorite ways that you think Casablanca has kind of transcended the screen to make an impact on the world today?
Well, it's given us archetypes, right? So this is a movie that set in motion archetypes that you still have in film today. Your gangster, your good gangster is Rick, right? And Ferrari, the blue parrot guy, Sidney Greenstreet, his look, right? When you see a bad person in a movie, they look like that guy, that actor, Sidney Greenstreet. I was just talking, we watched it for my son is doing a film class in college, and we watched it for that reason originally. And then I happened upon you, and I'm like, do you recognize this persona? And he's like, well, I go, well, Mad Max Fury Road. There's Sidney Greenstreet sitting in the car as the oil guy, right? And he's in the new one, Furiosa, as well. I mean, obviously, it's the post-apocalyptic version of him, but it looks like him. And so he transcended the movie so much that you can see it repeated again and again. The look of this person and his demeanor, right? He's not he's proper, but he's evil. And then even Renault, the two-faced authority, all of these things have gone on to be repeated throughout cinema history since this was done. Now, there may be some ahead of this that helped with that too, but you can pretty much put your finger on this one and say, yeah, this archetype came from this place, and we're still using it in movies today. It's interesting that can have so much impact. And I think part of that is because it's been revered and everyone has seen it. And so then as anyone who does a creative endeavor, right, it gets bits and pieces from everywhere. And the more popular something is, the more those bits and pieces infiltrate into the creativity. And so it really is something to see that and think, people nowadays won't even know it if they haven't had to watch it for whatever reason. I mean, I don't think that people actively go out and seek this movie nowadays unless they're in it for other reasons, right?
In film school,
film class, or or something like that. But it's been influencing things all along the way, and so so influential. It's just interesting. It's very
Which
interesting.
ties in two things that you had talked about a moment ago, where one, it would be really hard to do a remake of something like this because there are so many influences that you just have to get everything just right
Yeah,
in order
I
to
don't
be
know
able
how
to
you
do
get
that.
away with. People would be. I mean, you had to wait, I think, another generation or so. Unfortunately, it'll be like, I can't remember the title, but they did a comical version of Hamlet, and so they were trying to redo Hamlet, but it ended up the best way to do it was as a farce. And Woody Allen did this as a farce, right? Played against Sam. That's the way you have to do it. So you know you have to do the farce before, and I don't think they'll ever come back around. There's always probably going to be someone, even in Hollywood, who's like, we can't make a buck off of this one, you know.
Yeah, but it'll still stick around because I mean, what other movies are there that have like you said? I mean, you said it still holds up, right? And
It
it was
does.
made like 80 years ago. Another generation from now, it'll probably still hold up too. So,
Yeah.
how many movies can say that they do that, and that makes sense why
Not
there's so many things based on it.
not a lot. I mean, the weird thing is it kind of goes in, if you look back, it kind of goes in waves a little bit. I mean, because the other thing, we're getting up. I watched Maltese Falcon last night because my son needed to watch it for this class, and I said I'll watch it with it.
Nice.
And so yeah, we watched both of these, and they're both from that time period, right? And they both are now have transcended that time period. I would say Maltese Falcon is this Casablanca is way better than Maltese Falcon. As far as a movie goes, as far as pacing, as far as story, as far as drawing you into it and so forth, is way better. But they both captured the imagination of people into today, and will into the future, because it's just kind of that weird. It just so, and it. The funny thing is, we talk about it. And we're like, Humphrey Bogart is not the best actor, right? He's not even that good, really. If you think about it, he's kind of a one-trick pony, and he's the same in Maltese Falcon as he is in this. But it's the combination of things, right? It's the combination of the story and how it plays out and so forth, and the direction of the movie that really bring it above the fray. And so, to me, I would say Renault is the best actor in this movie. He's funny. He's interesting. He plays the part so well. I mean, Claude Rains plays him, and you're like, if I met this guy in a bar, he'd be that guy. Totally convincing. You know what I mean? Whereas Humphrey Bogart, you're like, I don't know. But it's interesting how the kind of the second tier players were all better actors than the top people. But unfortunately, in the history of popular things, that's usually the case. You can name almost any movie, and the primary actor is probably not the best actor in that movie. It's the second tier people who are all so much better at their jobs. The first thing comes to mind is Seinfeld, and he really admits it, that he's a horrible actor. But everybody else in that cast is so much better, and that's why it worked. Because if they were all lesser than Jerry, we wouldn't be talking about it.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I didn't think about that, but that's a good point. Yeah.
So, but that's, I think, the same thing here. But at the time, he was the star power, and people really liked him. He was, I guess, kind of not really an everyman. I don't think he was kind of portrayed as kind of a tougher guy, kind of a situation, kind of like Harrison Ford, right? So I would compare Humphrey Bogart to Harrison Ford. Harrison Ford, not the best actor, honestly. He plays Harrison Ford, right? He's Harrison Ford as the president. He's Harrison Ford as Han Solo. He's Harrison Ford. You know what I mean? He's not going to be Daniel Day-Lewis and meld into his he'd become Abraham Lincoln or anything. He's Harrison Ford, and I think that's what Humphrey Bogart was for the time, and he did a good job at that, really good job of that. But I think everybody else, even the waiters and so forth, were all better actors overall.
I guess they call them supporting actors for a reason. They support the whole show.
Yeah. Character actors, yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on to help us separate fact from fiction in Casablanca. Before I let you go, let's shift gears away from the movie's history and shift to your own. Can you share a little bit more about Static Radio for our listeners?
Oh, sure, if you want. So I co-host a show called Static Radio. We've been doing it for 25 years, audio on the internet. And basically each week we tell funny stories about things that typically happen to us. We recorded last night. So my story last night was about how I had a great hamburger in Columbia, Missouri. So if you want to have a great hamburger in Columbia, you might listen. And it veers off from there. It is comedic, humorous, and there's no direction. So you never know where it goes. We start with a story, and then the story takes a life of its own. And by the time we're finished, we don't even know where the end is until we get there. I hope I'm more of a Claude Rains than a Humphrey Bogart, but who knows?
I like that. I like that analogy. That's great. Isn't that what we all want in life? Be a little more Claude Rains than Humphrey Bogart.
Exactly.
Well, thank you again so much for your time.
Thanks for having me. This was great fun. I hope I did it justice.
This episode of Based on a True Story was produced by me, Dan Lefebvre. I'd like to thank Bob LeMent for taking the time to chat about the classic film Casablanca. If you want to hear more from Bob, check out his internet radio show over at staticradio.com. I've got all the links for this episode over at basedonatruestorypodcast.com/354. Okay, now it's time for the answer to our 2 truths and a lie game from the beginning of the episode. And as a quick refresher, here are the 2 truths and 1 lie. Number 1. Casablanca was not actually a pathway to escaping the Nazis. Number 2, the actors who worked on the movie actually escaped using a similar pathway in the movie. Number 3, there was a Jewish community in Morocco during the movie's timeline. Did you catch which one is a lie? Got the answer right here, so let's open this up and find out. And the lie is number 1. Casablanca was not actually a pathway to escaping the Nazis. As we learned from Bob, while specifics were dramatized for the film, of course, the idea of escaping Europe through Casablanca was completely true. Of course, it was just one path, and even the movie talks about that at the beginning. It admits that there were different routes taken by different people. But the common denominator was, of course, finding ways to escape fascism. Thank you so much for listening to another episode of Based on a True Story. As a one-person production, these episodes would not be possible without the support of Based on a True Story producers. If you're watching the video version of this, we're going to have credits roll at the end, so I'd encourage you to stick around so you can learn more about how you can become a producer and get your name in the credits for the next episode. Or if you're listening to the audio version, look in the show notes for a link to learn more over at basedonatruestorypodcast.com/producers. Until next time, thanks so much for spending your time with Bob and I today, and I'll chat with you again really soon.